Hello, everyone. I'm John, and welcome back to ASMR True Crime Story, where I share true stories in a calm, relaxing whisper. Before we begin, press a number in the comments for me. Press 1 if you're already part of our ASMR family. Press 0 if this is your first time here. And press 2 if you want another whispered true story in the next upload. If you're enjoying the calm, please like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's case. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and slow your breathing. Let's begin. Story 1. The date was Thursday, June 10th, 2021. It began like so many other early summer days in Newport, South Wales. The air was mild, the light soft, and the streets carried the familiar rhythm of everyday life. Children's voices could be heard in the distance. A few shops rolled their shutters halfway down for the evening, and the hum of cars along the main roads mixed with the occasional call of a seagull drifting inland from the coast. For most people, it was an ordinary day. They woke, worked, and wound down, without suspecting the darkness that would fall over the city before the night was through. But for one family, June 10th would mark the end of normal life. 26-year-old Ryan O'Connor was among those going about his day with no idea of what lay ahead. To friends, he was Apple, a nickname from years earlier that stuck to him like a badge of affection. Ryan was known for being friendly, easygoing, the type who could talk to anyone and make them feel at ease. He was sociable without being loud, grounded without being distant. Life at that moment was looking good for him. He was a proud new father to a little boy named Teddy, who was days away from celebrating his first birthday. Ryan was the sort of dad who carried his pride openly, showing pictures of Teddy to anyone who would look, smiling whenever he spoke of him. Professionally, he was on an upward path. He had just earned his construction skills certificate, which meant he could take work on building sites, and a new job was lined up to start the following week. On the other side of the city, the day was playing out differently for another group of young men. They were not thinking about certificates, job starts, or family milestones. They were focused on something else entirely, and their decisions would soon pull them into Ryan's life in the most violent way possible. Two of them, 19-year-olds Louis Colina and Elliot Pertani, had made car theft their craft. They weren't weekend opportunists. They planned their movements, targeted specific vehicles, and worked in practiced roles. Colina acted as the lookout, scanning a street or car park to ensure no one was watching. When the path was clear, Portani would move in, break a window, and use an electronic device to program a new key fob, the kind of tool that could be bought cheaply online, despite being designed for legitimate use. Once the car was unlocked and running, they would switch its number plates with those from a similar make and model already on the road. This trick gave the vehicle a false identity, making it less likely to attract police attention during casual checks. The stolen car would then be sold on, the cash split between them. It was not glamorous work, but it brought them quick money, and they knew there was a steady demand. On June 10th, their paths were already moving toward Ryan's. He couldn't have known it, but by the time the day was over, the lives of both he and his family would be irreversibly changed. Colina and Pertani had known each other for only a short time, just a few months, but in that period, they'd built a partnership rooted in criminal habits. While other young men their age might have bonded over sports, shared hobbies, or work, their common ground was found in risk and lawlessness. Colina had no official criminal record before this case, but that didn't mean he had lived without trouble. He had been known to carry knives. People close to him described flashes of a violent temper. There were accounts of him striking his girlfriend in the mouth, attacking her father, and recording himself assaulting a younger boy he accused of being a snitch. The act was troubling enough on its own, but recording it and sharing it openly suggested a dangerous pride and intimidation. When later arrested in connection to Ryan's case, Colina admitted to stealing around a dozen cars before that point. The car thefts might have been his main trade, but they weren't his only brushes with violence. He had been known to threaten, to attack, and to show off these acts without much care for the consequences. Purtani, by contrast, had a record already marked with a variety of offenses. He had been involved in violent crime and theft well before the events of June 10th. On August 27, 2019, he stole an Amazon delivery van. It wasn't just a quick theft. The incident turned into a police chase. Eventually, he abandoned the van and hid from officers. At the time, he was already banned from driving, but that restriction seemed to have meant little to him. Not long after, he stole hundreds of pounds worth of alcohol from a Tesco store, breaking the terms of a suspended sentence in the process. There were more convictions: assaulting his girlfriend, carrying a blade in public, taking vehicles without consent, dangerous driving, and robbery. Once, during a school trip, he smashed a milk bottle and stabbed another young person in the face with the broken glass, an attack so severe it led to a charge of grievous bodily harm. Neither man seemed to think much about the impact of his actions. Their histories showed patterns of impulsivity, aggression, and disregard for rules. On this summer day, they were moving along a familiar track, one that would soon place them in the same frame as Ryan O'Connor. Within the same circle of acquaintances as Colina and Purtani were others who would soon be linked to the night's events. One of them was Jeremy, still legally a minor at the time, but already no stranger to the criminal justice system. He had once been fitted with an electronic tag as part of a sentence for a serious knife offense. The conditions of that sentence were clear. He was to stay out of Cardiff, but Jeremy removed the tag, deliberately breaching the order. His record was already long for someone so young. He had been convicted of racially aggravated assault, possession of an imitation firearm, and was known to have a fascination with knives from an early age. Social media posts showed him posing with large blades, sometimes alongside friends, as if it were something to be proud of. Jeremy's personal life had been unsettled. He had been under the care of child and adolescent mental health services, and he had been diagnosed with ADHD and other conditions that made controlling impulses more difficult. There were reports of impulsive aggression, and he had a reputation for being quick to anger. There were also troubling signs of him struggling with thoughts of ending his life. His home life had changed in the weeks before the crime. His parents had separated when he was young, and a week before June 10th, he had moved in with another young man, Ethan Strickland. Strickland, 18 years old, had his own record. He had been caught with knives before and was no stranger to minor run-ins with the law. Alongside them was Kyle Reese, just 17 at the time. Like the others, he had been found with blades in the past. Reese, in particular, would later be identified as the person who supplied one of the knives used on June 10th. All of them shared a comfort with weapons and a willingness to be seen with them. They took photographs together holding knives, sometimes in balaclavas, as though such images were trophies. In their world, carrying a blade was part of the culture, an image to project, a way to gain respect or fear. By the time June 10th arrived, these connections and shared attitudes had drawn them into the same orbit. And that night, their movements would intersect in a stolen blue Ford Fiesta. In the early hours of June 10th, the group had already been active. They had stolen several cars in and around Cardiff, moving from one area to another under the cover of night. Among those stolen vehicles was a blue Ford Fiesta. The plates on the Fiesta had been cloned, taken from a similar model legally on the road. To anyone running a quick check, the registration would appear legitimate. That made it less likely the police would pull them over for something like no insurance, allowing them to move more freely. By about 12:45 a.m., they had returned to Cardiff. The Fiesta had not yet been sold, and without a buyer ready, it became their transport for the day ahead. As the evening drew closer, the group gathered inside the stolen car. Alongside Colina and Pertani were Jeremy, Reese, and Strickland. Each carried the items they thought they might need. Jeremy and Reese both had large hunting knives, 15 inches long, the type used in outdoor survival, capable of inflicting deep and fatal wounds. They also had gloves and balaclavas. Strickland, without a balaclava, wore a blue face mask that would still make identification difficult. Reese also had a metal club. These were not the possessions of people planning a harmless night out. They were the tools of intimidation and, if it came to it, violence. Whether fully discussed in advance or decided as they drove, the purpose was clear. They were looking for someone to stop and rob. At the same time, in another part of Newport, Ryan O'Connor's evening was unfolding in the warmth of family. Around 7 p.m., he had been at his brother Daniel's home, sharing a meal with Daniel and his partner Lauren. They were a close-knit family, the kind who enjoyed each other's company without needing a special reason to gather. Ryan was carrying something new that night, a black Gucci bag with a silver badge, something he had saved for and purchased himself. Inside, there were just two 20-pound notes. He had shown the bag to Lauren, even asking her to smell the leather. It was a small moment of pride, the kind that happens in ordinary life, without any thought of danger attached to it. At about 8:45 p.m., Ryan said his goodbyes. He told them he was going to see a friend and that they would see each other the next day. None of them could have known these were the last words they would share with him. The blue Ford Fiesta was already in Newport by the time Ryan left his brother's home. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of restless energy and sharp focus. The group had been cruising through the city streets, their eyes scanning for an opportunity. It was just before 9 p.m. when they saw him. Ryan was walking alone, wearing his new Gucci bag across his body. The silver badge caught the light, a small but noticeable detail from the distance of a passing car. The Fiesta slowed as it drew nearer, windows lowered slightly. In those few seconds, decisions were made without words. The driver kept the pace steady, while the others inside fixed their attention on him. As the car passed Ryan, it looped around, coming back in his direction. He didn't seem alarmed. To him, it might have looked like any other vehicle navigating the street. But inside the Fiesta, the tension was building. Colina and Pertani, both in the front, exchanged quick glances. Behind them, Reese adjusted his grip on the hunting knife, the gloved hand tightening around the handle. Jeremy shifted forward in his seat, eyes locked on the target. In that moment, there was no hesitation. The decision had been made. The car would stop, and they would take the bag. The Fiesta pulled to the side of the road, its sudden stop breaking the normal rhythm of the quiet street. The doors opened almost in unison. Jeremy and Reese were the first to move. They stepped out quickly, both holding their knives, the long blades glinting faintly under the streetlights. Strickland followed, keeping slightly behind, his face half covered by the blue mask. Ryan had only a moment to notice them before they closed the distance. The group's approach was fast, deliberate. He turned slightly, perhaps in confusion or to gauge what was happening. But the reality became clear in seconds. They were after him. One of them grabbed at the strap of his bag, yanking hard. Ryan resisted, pulling back with force. The struggle was short but fierce. In the same breath, a blade was raised and driven forward. Ryan stumbled, the shock of the blow halting his movements. He broke free enough to turn and run, clutching at his side. His steps quickened in desperation, carrying him toward the entrance of a nearby street where he knew houses stood close together. Behind him, the attackers turned and ran back toward the Fiesta. The entire encounter had lasted only moments, but it was enough to set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. The car's door slammed shut. Tires screeched. The stolen Fiesta sped away into the night. Ryan kept moving, but the wound was deep. Ryan's pace slowed as the pain in his side grew sharper. He pressed his hand hard against the wound, trying to keep the warmth from spilling out. Each breath came quicker, shorter, but he forced himself forward. He reached the entrance of the nearby street, his eyes searching for light, for movement, for anyone who could help. A few steps more, and he stumbled toward the front of a house where he knew someone lived. Voices called out when they saw him, startled, urgent voices that carried a tone of alarm. Ryan managed only a few words, enough for those nearby to realize he had been attacked. The shock on their faces told him they understood. Someone rushed inside to grab a phone, dialing emergency services. Others tried to keep him steady, guiding him toward a spot where he could sit while help was on the way. His breathing was heavy now, his shoulders rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. They told him to hold on, that an ambulance was coming. Ryan nodded faintly, but his gaze began to drift. In the distance, the sound of sirens began to grow. Faint at first, then sharper, echoing against the buildings. Blue lights reflected briefly against the windows and walls as the emergency vehicles drew closer. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the night air. In the dim light of the street, Ryan sat slumped, his breathing shallow and uneven. The people around him were tense, speaking in rushed voices, urging him to stay awake, telling him help was almost there. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics stepped out quickly, their movements brisk but controlled. They carried medical bags and equipment, their eyes immediately taking in the scene. A young man bleeding heavily, surrounded by anxious onlookers. One knelt beside Ryan, speaking to him in a steady voice, trying to keep him engaged while another began assessing the wound. Gloves snapped into place, and pressure was applied to slow the bleeding. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air as they worked. Ryan tried to speak, but his words came out faint, barely above a whisper. One of the paramedics leaned closer, listening intently. It was difficult to make out, but they caught fragments, enough to know he was trying to explain what had happened. The police were not far behind. A marked patrol car pulled up, the flashing blue lights washing over the street. Two officers stepped out, scanning the area, noting the distressed group, the ambulance, and the trail of blood leading back toward the road. One officer moved to speak with witnesses while the other stayed near the paramedics, taking in every detail. The urgency in the scene was clear. The attackers were still out there, and every second counted. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Ryan. Oxygen was fitted over his nose and mouth, and his pulse was checked repeatedly. The bleeding was severe, but they managed to slow it enough for transport. As the door shut, the siren wailed again, and the ambulance pulled away, heading at speed toward the hospital. Police officers followed close behind, determined to preserve every possible lead. Back at the scene, other officers began cordoning off the area with blue and white tape. They moved methodically, marking the spot where Ryan had collapsed and noting anything that could later become evidence. Droplets of blood, items dropped in the struggle, impressions on the pavement. Meanwhile, the witnesses gave their accounts. They described the sudden appearance of the car, the man who jumped out, the struggle for the bag. Their descriptions were hurried, but some details stood out. The blue Ford Fiesta, the knives, the mass. At the hospital, Ryan was taken straight into emergency care. Doctors and nurses gathered around, assessing the damage. The knife wound had cut deep, and there was significant internal bleeding. Surgical intervention was needed immediately. Despite the efforts of the medical team, the injury was catastrophic. Hours later, the news that no one wanted to hear came. Ryan O'Connor had died from his injuries. Back on the streets of Newport, the investigation intensified. The stolen Fiesta had vanished after the attack, and now, with a murder inquiry underway, finding it became a priority. Detectives began piecing together the movements of the car, speaking with anyone who might have seen it that night. Ryan's family was informed, the words hitting with the weight of finality. A normal evening had turned into something unthinkable, and their lives had changed forever. In the early hours that followed, a picture of the suspects began to emerge. CCTV footage, witness statements, and number plate checks all pointed toward the same group. But for now, they were still at large, and the hunt had only just begun. The investigation entered its first critical phase. Detectives knew that the blue Ford Fiesta was their most immediate lead. The stolen vehicle had been seen leaving the scene at speed, and every second that passed increased the chance it could be hidden, abandoned, or even destroyed. CCTV operators began reviewing footage from cameras along the likely escape routes. Frame by frame, the stolen Fiesta was tracked as it weaved through the streets, its movements erratic and fast, as if the driver was eager to put as much distance as possible between the car and the scene of the attack. One camera captured it making a sharp turn, the vehicle's brake lights flashing briefly before accelerating again. Another showed it passing under a streetlight, the glare reflecting off the bonnet for a split second. In the control room, officers marked each sighting on a map, building a visual path of the car's journey. They could see it moving away from the city center, heading toward quieter residential areas where cameras were less common. Detectives on the ground began canvassing door to door in those locations, asking residents if they had seen the vehicle or noticed anything unusual that night. Some recalled hearing a car speeding past. Others mentioned figures moving quickly along the pavement. Back at the station, automatic number plate recognition, ANPR, data was cross-checked. The stolen Fiesta's plates had been captured several times that evening, giving investigators a clearer idea of its route and time frame. By mid-morning, a breakthrough came. A member of the public reported seeing a blue Fiesta abandoned in a small car park behind a block of flats. Officers were dispatched immediately, and within minutes, they confirmed it was the vehicle they were looking for. The car was sealed off as a crime scene. Forensic officers arrived with gloves, cameras, and evidence bags. Every inch of the vehicle was photographed before the search began. Inside, they found discarded clothing, traces of blood, and fingerprints that would later prove invaluable. The discovery was a major step forward, but it was only the beginning. Now, the focus shifted to linking the suspects directly to the car, and ultimately to Ryan's murder. Detectives began cross-referencing the forensic evidence with known offenders in the area. Names started to appear, individuals with histories of violent crime, people already on police radar. The investigation was beginning to tighten around a small group. Meanwhile, the community was shaken. News of Ryan's death had spread quickly, and tributes began appearing near the scene. Flowers, notes, and candles lined the pavement, each one a silent message of grief and solidarity. For the officers leading the case, the emotion in the community was a reminder of the urgency. They knew the suspects were still out there, and until arrests were made, there was always the risk they could strike again. With the stolen Fiesta now in police custody, the forensic team worked methodically. Swabs were taken from the steering wheel, door handles, and gear stick. Every fingerprint, fiber, and trace of DNA was collected, labeled, and sent for urgent analysis. At the same time, detectives examined the clothing found inside. Some items match witness descriptions from the night of the attack: dark hoodies, tracksuit bottoms, and gloves. Others appeared to have been hastily discarded, possibly to avoid identification. The breakthrough came when initial forensic results identified DNA profiles linked to known offenders. These matches were no coincidence. They belonged to individuals with established histories of violence and robbery. Surveillance footage from the hours before the attack was then re-examined with a new focus. One clip showed 4 figures together, all wearing similar clothing to that found in the Fiesta. Another camera caught them entering the vehicle just minutes before it was seen heading toward the area where Ryan was attacked. Detectives now had both forensic evidence and visual confirmation tying the group to the stolen car. The next step was to put names to each face and build an airtight case. Information from informants began to flow in. The suspects' names started repeating in conversations. People who had been seen boasting about something that happened the previous night. Individuals suddenly trying to lie low, avoiding their usual hangouts. Officers worked quickly to piece together their movements after abandoning the Fiesta. CCTV showed them walking away from the car park in pairs, taking side streets and avoiding main roads. One camera caught a fleeting glimpse of them entering another vehicle, a possible getaway car driven by an associate. This new lead expanded the investigation. Detectives began tracking the second vehicle, identifying its owner and associates. Soon they confirmed it was linked to one of the suspects. With mounting evidence, the decision was made to move in. Surveillance teams monitored the suspects' homes, noting their comings and goings. Warrants were prepared, and an early morning raid was planned to catch them off guard. The community, meanwhile, remained tense. The memorial for Ryan continued to grow, with friends and family gathering to pay their respects. Messages of outrage and grief filled social media, with many calling for swift justice. As the day of the operation approached, officers reviewed every detail. Entry teams were briefed, vehicles were positioned, and arrest timings were synchronized to ensure no one slipped away. At dawn, the operation began. Doors were breached, shouts filled the air, and within minutes, the suspects were in custody. Each was taken to the station for questioning, the weight of the investigation now pressing firmly down on them. Inside the interview rooms, the suspects sat across from detectives, their demeanor ranging from defiant to uneasy. Each was cautioned and informed of the seriousness of the charges being considered. The questioning began with simple, direct prompts: where they were on the night of the attack, who they were with, what they were doing. Most offered vague answers, claiming not to remember or insisting they had been elsewhere. Some attempted to place themselves miles away from the scene, but when asked for proof, they had none. Detectives played sections of CCTV footage, pausing at key moments. The suspects shifted in their seats, some staring at the table, others leaning back with forced indifference. The stolen Fiesta appeared on screen, the grainy images showing them entering and leaving it. One suspect denied it was him in the footage. Another claimed the car had been borrowed and that they had no idea what had happened later. But when forensic results were mentioned, DNA from the steering wheel, fingerprints on the gear stick, their confidence began to falter. Still, none were willing to confess. The interviews stretched late into the night, with detectives rotating in and out, carefully chipping away at their stories. Each contradiction was noted, each inconsistency added to the case file. Meanwhile, officers continued gathering supporting evidence. Witnesses were re-interviewed to clarify details. Some recalled seeing the suspects together earlier in the evening. Others remembered snippets of conversation that hinted at their involvement. Phone records were obtained, mapping calls and messages between the group before and after the attack. The data showed a flurry of activity in the hours leading up to Ryan's death, followed by sudden silence immediately afterwards. A pattern detectives recognized from other cases where suspects tried to cover their tracks. Bit by bit, the timeline tightened. The suspects were placed in the stolen Fiesta in the area of the attack and in possession of clothing later found in the car. The pieces were aligning into a picture that was becoming harder for them to deny. As the second day of questioning ended, The weight of evidence was now enough for formal charges to be considered. The decision would rest on whether the prosecution felt the case was ready to go forward. By the morning of the third day in custody, the evidence was laid out in front of the senior investigators and the prosecution team. The CCTV, forensic results, witness accounts, and phone data formed a strong interconnected chain. Each suspect's role, whether direct or supportive, was becoming clearer. The decision came swiftly. All four would be charged in connection with Ryan's death. The paperwork was prepared, and the formal charges were read out in the station. None of the suspects spoke. Their earlier bravado had faded. Some stared at the floor. Others kept their eyes fixed on the wall. Word of the charges traveled quickly. In the community, relief mingled with ongoing grief. For Ryan's family, it was a step toward justice, but it did not ease the pain of losing him. His mother, in particular, expressed a mix of gratitude toward the police and devastation at the reality she now lived with. At the memorial site, more flowers appeared, along with notes and photographs. Friends gathered in small groups, speaking quietly, sharing memories of Ryan's kindness, his humor, and his loyalty. The tragedy had left a mark that would not fade quickly. In court, the suspects appeared for their first hearing. Dressed in plain clothing, they stood as the charges were read aloud. The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension, family members, members of the press, and local residents all watching closely. The defendants were remanded into custody pending trial. Outside, cameras clicked as reporters gave updates live to their audiences. The story was now firmly in the public eye, and the weight of expectation for justice was heavy. Back at the station, detectives reviewed the next phase, preparing for trial. Every statement, every exhibit, and every recorded interview would be scrutinized by the defense. The team knew the work was far from over. Securing convictions would require the same precision and persistence that had brought them this far. In the weeks that followed, the prosecution team worked side by side with detectives to prepare for trial. Every piece of evidence was cataloged and assessed for how it would stand up in the court. The CCTV sequences were edited into a clear chronological timeline that would be easy for a jury to follow. Forensic reports were double-checked, ensuring there were no gaps or points the defense could exploit. Witness statements were reviewed in detail. Some witnesses were nervous about testifying, worried about repercussions, while others were determined to speak for Ryan. Support officers worked with them to provide reassurance, explaining the court process and their rights. For Ryan's family, the waiting was exhausting. Each meeting with police brought a mixture of hope and dread. Hope for justice, dread for the reality of reliving the night he died. His mother spoke openly about her fears that the trial would drag them back into the pain they were just beginning to face. The defense solicitors began to reveal their strategies. They challenged the reliability of certain identifications, questioned whether the forensic evidence could have been transferred accidentally, and hinted at alibis that would be presented in the court. The prosecution was ready for this. They had anticipated most of these moves from the start. As the trial date drew closer, the case became a fixture in local media. Headlines reminded readers of the loss and the upcoming fight for justice. The community's interest was intense, and public opinion was strong. On the morning of the first day of trial, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters. Ryan's family arrived quietly, flanked by friends for support. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, the air charged with expectation. The defendants were brought into the dock, avoiding eye contact with the public gallery. The prosecution's opening statement set the tone, a factual, unflinching account of the events leading to Ryan's death. They laid out the evidence, the stolen Fiesta, the CCTV footage, the forensic matches, and the phone records. The jury was told they would hear from witnesses who had seen the suspects before and after the attack, and from experts who would explain the science behind the DNA and fingerprints. The defense countered with a call for caution, reminding the jury that the burden of proof was on the prosecution. They suggested there were alternative explanations for the evidence and urged the jury not to be swayed by emotion. The first witnesses were called, and the long, difficult process of testimony began. The first witness stepped into the box, sworn in under the watchful eyes of the judge and jury. They spoke carefully, recounting what they had seen on the night of the attack. The courtroom was silent, except for their voice, every detail hanging in the air. They described the moments before the violence, the sound of raised voices, and the sudden rush of movement. They recalled the stolen Fiesta, the blur of figures near it, and the unsettling feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The prosecution guided the witness patiently, drawing out the sequence of events. When the CCTV stills were shown, the witness identified key moments they remembered, matching their memory to the grainy images. Then came the cross-examination. The defense lawyer's tone was calm but probing, testing the limits of the witness's memory. They asked about the lighting, the distance, the stress of the moment, anything that might plant doubt in the minds of the jury. The witness held firm on most points, but admitted they could not be certain of every detail. One by one, more witnesses followed. A passerby who had seen the stolen car earlier in the evening, a neighbor who had heard commotion outside, a shop worker who remembered seeing a group matching the suspect's description near the area. The forensic experts were next. They explained the DNA matches in precise, simple terms, walking the jury through how samples were collected, stored, and analyzed. The fingerprints on the gear stick and door handle were shown in enlarged photographs. The similarities highlighted. The defense challenged the chain of custody, suggesting contamination or innocent transfer. The experts countered with clear explanations, reinforcing that the procedures followed left no room for such errors. As the days of testimony continued, Ryan's family sat quietly in the gallery. Each new account brought back images they wished they could forget, but they stayed, determined to see the process through. By the end of the second week of trial, the jury had heard from over a dozen witnesses. The evidence was stacking up, each piece reinforcing the prosecution's version of events. Yet the defense still had their turn to come, and their strategy remained to be seen. When it was finally the defense's turn to present their case, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The prosecution had built a wall of evidence over the past 2 weeks, but now the defense was looking for cracks, any gap they could widen into reasonable doubt. The first move came through cross-examination of a police officer who had handled crucial forensic items. The defense lawyer asked about the exact sequence of storage, the time each piece of evidence changed hands, and whether gloves had been changed at every step. The officer answered with calm precision, explaining each procedure as if walking the jury through a manual. Still, the defense pressed harder, suggesting that even the smallest slip could introduce contamination. The officer denied it had happened, but the lawyer left the possibility lingering in the air. Then came the defendant's own witnesses. One by one, they took the stand, friends, relatives, and acquaintances of the accused, each offering accounts designed to soften the image the prosecution had painted. Some claimed the accused were elsewhere during parts of the evening. Others described them as incapable of the violence suggested. But under cross-examination, inconsistencies began to show. Times didn't match. Locations overlapped with CCTV footage, placing the accused elsewhere. In some cases, a witness's memory shifted when reminded of earlier police statements they had given. The most tense moment came when one of the accused decided to take the stand. Dressed neatly, speaking in measured tones, they insisted on their innocence. They denied involvement in the attack, denied carrying any weapon, and claimed they had been caught up in a misunderstanding. The prosecution was relentless. They confronted the accused with video stills, DNA matches, and mobile phone data. Each question was sharp, designed to narrow the space for evasive answers. When asked directly about being seen near the scene moments before the violence, the accused hesitated, just long enough for the silence to feel heavy in the room. They claimed they could not recall, but the jury had already been shown the footage. Throughout it all, Ryan's family watched, their faces a mix of grief and determination. For them, each denial felt like another wound, yet they remained steadfast, waiting for the day the verdict would be spoken. By the time the defense rested their case, the jury had been given two competing pictures, one built on a structured timeline of evidence, the other on fragments of doubt and alternative explanations. The trial was moving toward its final stage, closing arguments. When the day for closing arguments arrived, the courtroom seemed quieter than usual, as though everyone sensed the weight of what was about to happen. The jurors sat in their box, eyes forward, notebooks ready. The prosecution rose first. Their voice was calm but carried authority, honed from days of preparation. They began by reminding the jury of the victim, Ryan, not just as a name in a case file, but as a son, a friend, and a young man whose life had been cut short in violence that should never have happened. They walked the jury back through the timeline, point by point. The stolen car, the gathering of the group, the CCTV footage showing movements at crucial moments, the DNA and fingerprints, the witness statements, all aligning in ways that could not be dismissed as coincidence. They acknowledged that no single piece of evidence stood alone as absolute proof, but together, they formed a picture so clear it could not be ignored. Every fact, they argued, led back to the same conclusion. The defendants had been there, they had taken part, and their actions had caused Ryan's death. The prosecution's tone was firm, but not theatrical. It was the quiet conviction of someone who believed the truth spoke for itself. They asked the jury to remember that justice was not about speculation or sympathy for the accused, but about the facts presented in court. When they finished, the defense lawyer stood, buttoning their jacket slowly before stepping forward. Their voice was softer at first, measured, almost conversational. They reminded the jury of their duty, not to convict on suspicion, but only if they were sure beyond reasonable doubt. They began picking at the prosecution's case, questioning the clarity of the CCTV images, highlighting the witnesses who had been unsure of times and details, suggesting that DNA could be transferred in ways that didn't involve direct contact during the attack. They reminded the jury that the burden of proof lay entirely with the prosecution, and if there was any doubt in their minds, that doubt must lead to acquittal. They painted the accused as young men caught in a web of assumptions and misinterpretations, their lives now hanging in the balance. It was a performance aimed at planting hesitation, a seed of uncertainty that could grow in the deliberation room. When both sides had spoken, the judge addressed the jury. His instructions were clear and deliberate, explaining the law, the meaning of joint enterprise, and how they must assess the evidence. He told them to set aside emotion and base their verdict only on what they had heard in court. Then, with the entire room watching, the jury was sent out to deliberate. The heavy doors closed behind them, leaving the rest of the court in a waiting silence. The jury filed out through the side door, their expressions unreadable. 12 ordinary people now carried the extraordinary weight of deciding the fate of the accused. The heavy oak door closed behind them with a quiet thud, leaving the rest of the courtroom in a suspended state. Hours passed in uneasy stillness. Family members of both the victim and the defendants remained in their seats, some whispering prayers under their breath, others staring at the floor, lost in thought. Every time the door opened for a court clerk or usher, heads would lift in sudden anticipation, only to lower again when it wasn't the jury returning. The waiting stretched into the next day. Each morning, The judge would remind everyone that deliberations could take as long as needed. The jury was instructed to weigh each piece of evidence carefully, to speak freely among themselves, and to reach a decision only when every member was certain of their stance. By the afternoon of the second day, the atmosphere had thickened. Even the legal teams, usually composed and methodical, showed signs of tension. The prosecution's lead counsel tapped a pen rhythmically against the table, while one of the defense lawyers paced the corridor outside during breaks. On the morning of the third day, word spread quietly through the courtroom. The jury had reached verdicts. Within minutes, everyone was back in place. The ushers moved quickly but respectfully, making sure both sides of the public gallery were seated. The door opened, and the jurors returned in single file, their eyes fixed ahead. Some looked solemn, others pale, and one or two avoided eye contact entirely. They took their seats, the foreperson holding a folded sheet of paper. The judge addressed them directly. "Madam Foreperson, have you reached verdicts upon which you are all agreed?" "Yes, we have," came the quiet reply. The clerk of the court stood and began the formal questions, naming each defendant in turn and asking for the verdict on each charge. For the first name, the foreperson's answer was clear: "Guilty." A ripple went through the public gallery, stifled sobs from one side, gasps from the other. The second name, "Guilty." The third, "Guilty." Each word landed with the finality of a gavel, and each time the reactions grew more intense. By the time the last verdict was spoken, Ryan's family clung to each other, tears flowing freely. Across the room, relatives of the convicted sat frozen, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others breaking down entirely. The judge thanked the jury for their service, acknowledging the difficulty of the task they had faced. Then he turned his attention to sentencing. He reminded the court of the severity of the crime, a violent, senseless act that had taken the life of a young man and left a permanent void in his family's world. He spoke of the need for justice, not just for Ryan, but to reaffirm the rule of law. When the sentences were finally read out, they carried the weight of the court's judgment. Long years in prison for each of the convicted, reflecting their role in the attack and the gravity of the loss they had caused. As the defendants were led away, some glared defiantly, others looked down at the floor, their expressions unreadable. The sound of the heavy cell doors closing behind them seemed to echo in the minds of everyone present. For Ryan's family, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but nothing could bring him back. Outside the courthouse, the air was sharp with the bite of early winter. News crews had gathered along the steps, cameras poised, microphones extended. The moment the heavy wooden doors opened, the crowd pressed forward, the hum of voices rising into a wave of noise. Ryan's family emerged first, flanked by close friends and a police liaison officer. Their faces showed exhaustion as much as grief, but there was also a quiet strength in the way they held themselves. They paused at the base of the steps, the spokesperson, Ryan's father, stepping forward to speak. His voice trembled only once at the beginning before steadying. "Today's verdict brings us some measure of justice for Ryan. We have waited a long time for this moment, and while nothing will ever heal the pain of losing him, we can at least begin to move forward, knowing that those responsible have been held accountable." He thanked the police officers who had worked tirelessly on the case, the witnesses who had come forward despite their fears, and the members of the public who had supported the family throughout the long ordeal. But he also spoke about Ryan, not as a victim in a legal process, but as a son who had been full of life, with dreams, laughter, and kindness. He described his love for football, his loyalty to his friends, and the way his presence could brighten a room. When he finished, there was a hush among the crowd. Even the journalists seemed momentarily still before the flurry of questions began. The family did not answer further. They simply turned and walked away together, holding on to one another. Elsewhere in the city, the verdicts were already sparking conversations. In Ryan's old neighborhood, friends who had grown up with him gathered quietly, sharing memories over mugs of tea in small kitchens and corner cafes. Some talked about how the justice system had worked, others about how no sentence could truly balance the scales after a life was taken. In the streets near where the crime had occurred, there was a mix of relief and lingering unease. Some residents expressed gratitude that the case was resolved, while others spoke about wanting more community support to prevent such violence in the future. The local paper ran a front-page headline the next morning, "Justice for Ryan." Alongside it was a photograph of him taken 2 years before his death, smiling with his arm around a friend's shoulders. In the weeks that followed, a small memorial garden was created in Ryan's honor. Friends planted flowers, placed photographs, and left handwritten notes. In the evenings, candles flickered there, a reminder to anyone passing that a young life had been stolen, and that his absence was felt every single day. The family visited often. Sometimes they came with fresh flowers, sometimes just to sit in silence. And while the court case was over, their journey through grief continued, one day at a time. In the aftermath of the trial, the police force began a thorough review of their investigation. Senior officers met behind closed doors to discuss what had gone right, what could have been done sooner, and how lessons from Ryan's case could be applied in future. They looked closely at the early stages of the inquiry, the first witness statements, the CCTV recovery, and the initial suspect interviews. Every step was examined, not to find fault for the sake of blame, but to understand how each decision had shaped the eventual outcome. One of the key points raised was the role of community cooperation. Several witnesses had come forward only after being approached multiple times, and in some cases, it had taken weeks for them to feel safe enough to speak. Detectives noted that stronger community trust from the outset might have brought critical information to light earlier. The case also highlighted the importance of CCTV in modern policing. The painstaking work of collecting, reviewing, and cross-referencing hours of footage had been crucial in piecing together the movements of those involved. Officers agreed that expanding camera coverage in certain areas could help prevent and solve crimes more quickly. Training programs were updated, ensuring that future investigators would be better prepared for complex cases involving multiple suspects and overlapping accounts. New guidelines were also issued for working with bereaved families, recognizing the emotional strain they endure and the importance of clear, compassionate communication. Outside the force, the case had stirred discussions among local leaders and residents about safety. Community groups began organizing evening patrols and awareness campaigns, urging neighbors to look out for one another and to report suspicious activity immediately. Schools invite officers to speak with students about personal safety, conflict resolution, and the long-term consequences of violent behavior. These sessions were not just about rules and warnings. They aimed to give young people practical tools for making better decisions and avoiding dangerous situations. Ryan's name was often mentioned during these talks. His story became a reminder, not in a sensational way, but as a real example of how quickly lives can change and how deep the loss can be when violence enters a community. For his family, seeing these changes was bittersweet. They were glad that something positive might come from their tragedy, but it was also a reminder that their son was no longer there to see it. Still, they chose to take part in some of the initiatives, sharing their experiences in the hope of helping others. By the end of that year, the area felt subtly different. The pain of what had happened remained, but there was also a sense of resilience, a quiet determination to learn from the past and to protect the future. In the months that followed, life for Ryan's family slowly settled into a fragile routine. The sharp intensity of the court proceedings was gone. replaced by the quieter, heavier weight of daily life without him. His bedroom remained much as it had been, the shelves still lined with trophies from school sports days, the photographs pinned neatly to the corkboard above his desk. His mother often found herself standing in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, as if she might speak to him and hear his reply. Friends continued to visit. Sometimes they brought small gifts, a framed photograph, a poem they'd written, a memento from a place Ryan had loved. Other times they came simply to sit, sharing memories over tea. The house, though quieter now, still carried the warmth of those who cared for him. On certain afternoons, his father would walk to the memorial garden. The flowers there had changed with the seasons, spring blossoms giving way to summer roses, then the muted tones of autumn leaves. People from the community often stopped by, leaving candles or notes. Some he knew well, others he recognized only by sight. Yet each gesture was a reminder that Ryan's life had touched far more people than the family had realized. At times, the grief was still raw, catching them unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a familiar voice in a crowd, the sight of a group of young men Ryan's age laughing together. But alongside that grief was a growing sense of gratitude for the support they had received. His younger cousins often asked about him, wanting to hear stories from when he was their age. The family made a point of keeping those stories alive, about the time he'd tried to build a go-kart from scrap wood, or the summer he insisted on learning to fish despite having no patience for sitting still. These moments brought both laughter and tears, but they kept his spirit close. The family also worked quietly with a local charity, setting up a small fund in Ryan's name to support youth programs in the area. They believed in giving young people positive paths, chances to explore talents, and spaces to feel safe. The kind of opportunities that might steer someone away from the kind of choices that had led to Ryan's death. As the first anniversary of his passing approached, preparations began for a community event in his memory. It would be held in the park near the memorial garden, a day for friends, neighbors, and supporters to come together, share food, play music, and remember the young man whose absence was still felt deeply. It wasn't about reliving the loss, but about celebrating the life that had been and reaffirming the bonds that tragedy had brought to the surface. The day of the anniversary dawned calm, with a pale sky that promised a clear afternoon. Early in the morning, volunteers began setting up in the park, arranging folding tables, hanging strings of bunting, and placing chairs in small clusters beneath the shade of trees. The air carried the faint scent of fresh grass and cut flowers. By midday, people began to arrive, some carrying plates of homemade food, others with bouquets, framed photographs, or handwritten cards. Friends who hadn't seen each other since the trial embraced quietly, their expressions a mix of sadness and warmth. At one side of the park, a long table was covered with a white cloth and set with candles, each one waiting to be lit. Beside them sat a large photo of Ryan, smiling, captured on a summer day years before. His family stood nearby, greeting visitors, accepting hugs, and exchanging gentle words. There were moments of stillness, when the gathering seemed to pause, as if in reflection, and moments filled with light laughter as old stories were shared. One of Ryan's closest friends spoke to a small group about the first time they had met, how Ryan's kindness had been immediate, his humor disarming, and his loyalty unwavering. Others nodded, each holding their own version of that memory. Music played softly from a portable speaker, songs that Ryan had loved. At certain points, the melody caught someone off guard, and their eyes would mist over, but the music was part of the day's rhythm, weaving joy and sorrow together. As the sun dipped lower, the candles were lit one by one. Each flame seemed to carry a story, a moment, a feeling. The light spread slowly across the table until the photograph of Ryan glowed warmly against the evening sky. When it was time to speak, Ryan's mother stepped forward. Her voice, steady at first, grew thick with emotion as she thanked everyone for coming, not just to remember her son, but to stand together as a community. She spoke of the lessons his life and loss had taught, and of her hope that those lessons would keep others safe. There was a long silence afterward, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Then, quietly, people began to place their candles along the base of the memorial garden stone, the flickering light joining the flowers and messages left there. As darkness settled, the gathering slowly broke apart. Some lingered, reluctant to leave, while others walked home arm in arm. For the family, it was a day of mixed emotions, the ache of loss as sharp as ever, but also the comfort of knowing Ryan had not been forgotten. In the months after the anniversary gathering, the rhythm of daily life returned for many, but for those closest to Ryan, it was a different kind of normal. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, and the public attention had faded. Yet the absence was a constant presence in their homes, in their routines, in the quiet moments when they least expected it. Ryan's parents spoke often about how silence seemed louder now. His mother found herself glancing at the phone, half expecting a message that would never come. His father admitted that he sometimes drove past places they used to visit together. The coffee shop on the corner, the old park with the rusted swings, without meaning to, as if muscle memory was steering him there. The community, too, carried traces of the loss. Those who had attended the trial still remembered the tension in the courtroom, the weight of waiting for the jury's return, the way the air had felt heavier in those final minutes before the verdict was read. When neighbors met in the street, they sometimes still spoke of it in low voices, not out of gossip, but as if acknowledging a chapter in their shared history. Ryan's close friends kept in touch more than they had before. They would meet for coffee, catch up on each other's lives, and inevitably end up reminiscing. They found comfort in swapping stories, sometimes funny, sometimes bittersweet, because keeping his memory alive felt like a way of keeping him close. One of his friends admitted during a quiet conversation that they had struggled to sleep after the trial. Certain images from the testimony replayed in their mind, and they found themselves avoiding news reports or anything that might trigger those memories. Others confessed similar feelings, each of them learning in their own way how to navigate grief. The family received occasional letters from people who had followed the case from a distance, strangers who wanted to express their condolences, share their own experiences of loss, or thank the family for speaking so openly about what had happened. Some letters came from faraway towns, others from just a few streets over. Each one, no matter how brief, was read carefully and kept. As spring turned to summer, the garden where Ryan's memorial stood began to bloom. Volunteers continued to tend it, pulling weeds, planting fresh flowers, and ensuring the small stone was never obscured. Some visitors came quietly, leaving flowers without a word. Others would pause for several minutes, as if speaking to him in their own thoughts before walking away. The investigation files were eventually archived, but the case remained in conversations among those who had been there from the beginning. Detectives who had worked the case said privately that it was one of the ones they would always remember, not because it was the most complex, but because it had touched the heart of the town so deeply. For Ryan's family, there was no sense of closure in the way people often imagine. There was justice in the verdict, yes, but justice and healing are not the same thing. Healing was slower, more uneven, and would likely be ongoing for the rest of their lives. As the season shifted once more, the rhythm of the town carried on. But for Ryan's family, each new month marked another stretch of time without him. His absence was felt in ways both subtle and sharp. A missing place at the dinner table, a voice absent from holiday gatherings, a laugh that no one could quite replicate. The legal process had concluded, but the weight of loss lingered. There were days when his parents could talk about him freely, sharing happy memories, laughing at old stories. And there were other days when grief settled in without warning, stealing their words, leaving them quiet and reflective. On what would have been Ryan's next birthday, the family gathered at the memorial garden. Friends joined them, some holding flowers, others carrying small candles. The evening was cool, with a faint breeze that stirred the leaves in the trees. A few people spoke, their voices steady but tinged with emotion. They talked about Ryan's kindness, his quick wit, and the way he had a knack for making people feel seen. As the sun set, the candles flickered, casting small circles of light in the growing darkness. There was no formal program, no speeches beyond those who wished to share. It was simply a gathering of those who loved him, standing together in the quiet, honoring the life that had been taken too soon. In the months that followed, the family found different ways to keep his memory alive. His mother began sorting through old photographs, carefully placing them into albums. His father spent weekends restoring a small bench in the garden where Ryan had often sat. Friends organized a small charity run in his name, with proceeds going to causes he had cared about. Local news outlets occasionally revisited the case, especially around anniversaries, but the family kept their public comments brief. They had said what they needed to say during the trial and in the immediate aftermath. Now, their focus was on preserving what was left of their privacy while protecting his memory. Privately, they continued to lean on each other. They learned to navigate moments that felt heavier. The first winter without him, the first family celebration where his absence was undeniable. And in those moments, they reminded each other that while grief changes shape over time, it never truly disappears. By the second year after the verdict, the community's life had largely returned to its everyday pace. New events filled the local calendar. Children grew older. New families moved into the neighborhood. Yet those who had known Ryan would still pause when passing the memorial garden, or find themselves recalling something he had once said. And while the case might not have been in the headlines anymore, for those who had lived it, its imprint remained. Not just in court records or archive files, but in the small personal ways it had changed them all. 2 years had passed since the trial, and while the world outside seemed unchanged, the lives of those closest to Ryan were forever different. His parents had learned how to move through their days without him, though the ache never fully faded. They spoke of him often, not in hushed tones, but as a way to keep his presence close. The memorial garden had become a quiet sanctuary. Neighbors who had never even met Ryan would sometimes stop there, sitting on the restored bench or leaving a small token, a flower, a note, a ribbon tied to the fence. His family noticed each one, touched by the silent gestures from strangers who cared. On the third anniversary of his death, the gathering was smaller, more intimate. The candles were lit again, the glow soft against the night. A few friends shared memories, some lighthearted, some bittersweet. The wind carried the faint scent of flowers from the nearby beds, and for a moment, the place felt peaceful. As the evening drew to a close, his father spoke quietly to those present. He thanked them for standing by the family through the hardest years of their lives. He asked that Ryan be remembered not for the way his life ended, but for the way he had lived, with warmth, humor, and compassion. After the gathering, the family stayed behind for a while. They didn't speak much, simply sat together on the bench as the last candles burned low. In that stillness, they found a small measure of comfort. The years that followed brought gradual healing, though the loss remained part of their story. Life continued, birthdays, holidays, everyday routines. But Ryan's memory was woven into it all. They kept his photographs in the living room, his laughter in their memories, his kindness in the way they treated others. In the end, the case became one more chapter in the town's history. But for the people who loved him, Ryan was not just a name in court records or a headline from years past. He was a son, a brother, a friend, and in their hearts he always would be. Thank you for listening all the way through this story. Ryan's life mattered, and by sharing his story, we keep his memory alive. If you value these stories and want to hear more, please take a moment right now to subscribe. It only takes a second, but it means the world, and it ensures you'll never miss the next case we share. Now, take a deep breath, let your mind settle, because in just a moment, we'll begin a brand new story. Story 2. The city of Sacramento in the 1980s looked to many like the picture of success. Streets bustled with workers, cafes stayed busy well into the afternoon, and the scent of fresh coffee mixed with the warm California air. Developers and shop owners spoke of nothing but growth, and people arrived in waves to chase the promise of a better life. But beneath the golden surface of this prosperity was a shadow no one wanted to look at. A quiet crisis was spreading through the neighborhoods, ignored by those who preferred to keep their eyes fixed on the brightness of the city's boom. On street corners and under bridges, people slept on thin blankets, their belongings tucked in plastic bags. The homeless population had swelled far beyond what the city could handle. Many of them battled illness, mental struggles, or the weight of past hardships. Part of this came from choices far outside their control. California had sharply reduced funding for social programs, and mental health institutions in particular were hit the hardest. Hospitals and care centers closed their doors, leaving many with nowhere to go but the streets. And for most residents, it was easier not to see them at all. If they spotted a figure huddled in a doorway, they simply looked away, walking a little faster to return to the comfort of their routines. It was in this environment, in the middle of Sacramento's golden age, that people living on the margins began to disappear. There were no missing posters, no frantic relatives, no evening news bulletins, because so many of them had no one to speak for them. One by one, they simply vanished. No one could know it yet, but someone had found the perfect victims. The story truly begins in late September of 1988. Judy Moyes, a middle-aged social worker with a steady but compassionate manner, hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment. She'd been trying to reach one of her clients, a man named Bert Montoya, for weeks. Each time she called, she was told he wasn't available. For Judy, Bert wasn't just another name on her case list. Over the years, she had come to know him well. She'd first met him at a detox center where she worked, the Volunteers of America Detoxification Center in Tucson, and had watched him struggle but also survive. Bert's full name was Alberto Rogas Montoya. Born in Costa Rica, he had moved with his family to the southern United States when he was just 16. It was around that time that his life began to take a difficult turn. Voices that no one else could hear began to follow him. Waves of paranoia and troubling delusions crept into his days. Eventually, doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia. His parents, overwhelmed and unsure of how to help, admitted him to a mental institution. There he was given shock treatments and heavy medication, which often made him feel worse rather than better. When he was finally released, Bert decided to leave the South altogether. He wandered west until he reached Sacramento, where he lived mostly on the streets. Judy remembered the first time she saw him. There was a gentleness in the way he spoke, even when his thoughts were tangled. Something about him felt deeply human, vulnerable but kind. She made it her goal to help him find stability, checking in on him regularly and doing what she could to make sure he had food, clothing, and some measure of safety. By 1988, Judy had managed to do what once seemed impossible. She found him a place to live. It wasn't just any room. This was a boarding house in central Sacramento, on a quiet street lined with historic homes. The address was 1426 F Street. The woman who ran it, a 59-year-old named Dorothea Puente, was well known in local social service circles. She had a reputation for opening her doors to the people no one else wanted to take in. The mentally ill, those fighting alcoholism, people struggling with addiction, and others who were living with serious health conditions. To Judy, this sounded like a rare and wonderful find. She had been told that Dorothea was also active in local politics, donated to charities, and even served free meals to the homeless. When Judy and Bert visited the house, they found it to be a beautiful two-story home painted a soft, welcoming blue, with ornate trim and a wide front porch. Inside, the atmosphere seemed calm, even pleasant. They met some of the other tenants, who spoke warmly about their lives there. One of them, a man named John Sharp, another former client of Judy's, assured her that it felt more like a real home than just a shelter. And then there was Dorothea herself. She was dressed neatly, her hair perfectly set, her glasses framing a face that looked every bit the part of a kindly grandmother. She smiled often, speaking to Bert in Spanish as she gave them a tour. Her tone was warm, her gestures welcoming. "This will be your room," she told him gently. "I hope you'll like it. Here's your bed, your television. We serve meals once a week, and I make sure everyone eats well." She asked Bert if he planned to pay rent from his Social Security checks, and if so, whether someone was able to receive the checks on his behalf. If not, she explained, she was already the payee for several of her tenants and would be happy to handle it for him. Judy left that day feeling relieved, even grateful. Bert would finally have a roof over his head, a safe space, and someone to look after him. In February 1988, Bert moved in. At first, everything seemed exactly as Judy had hoped. When she visited, Bert looked clean, well-fed, and neatly dressed. He seemed calmer, more settled than she'd seen him in years. But by September, just 7 months later, she began to notice something was wrong. When she called to check on him one afternoon, Dorothea told her that Bert was away visiting family in Mexico. Judy was surprised. Bert had always been anxious about going anywhere unfamiliar, and she couldn't imagine him suddenly traveling to another country. When she called again weeks later, the story was the same. He was still away. The more she heard, the more her concern grew. Something about Dorothea's casual responses didn't sit right with her. Judy decided that if she didn't hear from Bert by November 7th, she would go to the police. This is where the first threads of a much darker truth began to unravel. By late September 1988, Judy's patience had worn thin. Each time she tried to reach Bert, she was met with the same story. He was still away in Mexico. It didn't make sense. Bert wasn't the type to make spontaneous trips, and certainly not across borders. Then one morning, the phone on Judy's desk rang. The caller introduced himself as a relative of Bert's, saying he had taken Bert to live with him in Utah. The words felt strange in Judy's ears. Bert had never mentioned family in Utah, and the voice, calm, certain, somehow made her feel even more uneasy. She decided she could no longer take Dorothea's explanations at face value. Judy reached out to someone she knew she could trust, John Sharp, one of the other tenants in the boarding house. When she asked about Bert, John told her flatly that Bert didn't live there anymore, and that no one in the house had heard anything about him going to Mexico. Judy hesitated for a moment before asking if everything in the house was all right. John paused. "She's been digging a lot of holes," he said quietly. Those words were enough. Judy went straight to the Sacramento police and filed a missing person report for Bert Montoya. Within hours, an officer arrived at 1426 F Street. Dorothea greeted him warmly, her manner unchanged, and led him through the house. The rooms were neat, the kitchen orderly, the backyard garden well kept. John Sharp happened to be with them, answering questions politely alongside Dorothea. When the officer asked about Bert leaving so suddenly, Dorothea explained that her tenants could come and go as they pleased, and if Bert wanted to be with his family, he had every right. She repeated the story about his relatives picking him up, adding that she wished she'd been home to say goodbye. The officer nodded, thanked them both, and began to head for the door. It was then that John made his move. As the officer turned to leave, John slipped him a folded piece of paper. Later, when the officer opened it, he found a simple message written in neat cursive. "She wants me to lie to you." The note set things in motion. The case was handed to Detective John Cabrera, a man known for his thoroughness. He started by looking into Dorothea's background, and what he found pulled the story in a far darker direction. Dorothea Helen Gray had been born in Redlands, California in 1929. Her early life was anything but stable. Family troubles, personal hardships, and a string of rocky marriages shaped her youth. Somewhere along the way, she began bending the law, and eventually breaking it outright. In 1960, she was arrested after an undercover officer caught her working in a Sacramento brothel. She spent 90 days in county jail. She was just 31 years old and in her second marriage at the time. 6 years later, she married again, her third husband, and took his last name, Puente. That marriage didn't last either, but it was during this time that she opened her first boarding house. From the beginning, Dorothea focused on clients that other landlords refused, those with mental illnesses, drug or alcohol problems, and no family to watch over them. It didn't take long for her to find a way to profit from their vulnerability. Many of her tenants received Social Security checks, and by becoming their payee, Dorothea could collect their money directly. In some cases where she wasn't the official payee, she simply forged their signatures and took the checks for herself. The scheme worked for nearly a decade. To maintain her image, she donated to charities and attended political functions, rubbing shoulders with local leaders. She told glamorous, unlikely stories about her past, that she had danced with the Rockettes, met presidents, and mingled with Hollywood stars. But in 1978, her carefully built image cracked. A former tenant realized his Social Security checks were still being sent to the boarding house long after he'd moved out, and discovered Dorothea had been cashing them. She was arrested and convicted of check forgery. While she avoided prison time, she was put on 5 years of federal probation and forbidden from running a boarding house or working with the elderly or mentally ill. That restriction didn't last. By the early 1980s, Dorothea was working again as an in-home caregiver. She altered her appearance, patterned dresses, oversized glasses, hairstyle to make her look older, and leaned into the image of a harmless grandmother. But behind the gentle smile, she was quietly giving certain patients unnecessary medications, including tranquilizers, and stealing from them while they were incapacitated. One by one, small thefts gave way to more dangerous behavior. By 1979, Dorothea was living at 1426 F Street, renting the upper floor from a friend. It was there that she met a woman named Ruth Monroe. Ruth was in her 60s, friendly and warm, and soon the two women became close. They decided to start a small catering business together and opened a joint bank account to fund it. When Ruth's husband fell ill, Dorothea suggested she move into the boarding house to save money. Ruth's children agreed, trusting Dorothea, who claimed to be a nurse, to take good care of her. But within weeks, Ruth began to feel unwell. She grew weaker each day, often lying still with her eyes open, saying little. Dorothea explained it away, sometimes refusing visitors by saying Ruth needed rest. On April 28, 1982, Dorothea told Ruth's children their mother had passed away. The coroner ruled it a suicide from an overdose of codeine and acetaminophen. The family was shocked. Ruth had shown no signs of wanting to end her life. Later, they discovered the joint bank account was empty, with thousands of dollars missing. They began to suspect Dorothea had poisoned her. That suspicion grew stronger when, just months later, Dorothea was convicted in a separate case for illegally drugging and stealing from another elderly man. She served 3 years in prison before returning to 1426 F Street in 1985. With no apparent supervision, despite warnings from state psychologists that she was dangerous, and showed no remorse. It was in this same house, just 3 years later, that Bert Montoya had come to live. Detective Cabrera now knew he wasn't investigating an ordinary missing person case. Bert might not be the first tenant to vanish from 1426 F Street, and if John Sharp's note was to be believed, Dorothea might be hiding far more than she was willing to admit. The next step would take him straight to her doorstep. Detective John Cabrera had already read more than enough about Dorothea Puente's past to know she wasn't the harmless landlady she appeared to be. The history of theft, the suspicious deaths, the convictions, all of it painted a picture of someone who could be dangerous to the very people she claimed to help. Still, what Judy Moyes had told him lingered in his mind, the tenant who said Dorothea had been digging a lot of holes in her garden, and that note John Sharp had secretly slipped to an officer. "She wants me to lie to you," was impossible to ignore. It was time to confront her directly. On November 11, 1988, Cabrera arrived at 1426 F Street with another detective, James Wilson, and Dorothea's parole officer. Dorothea opened the door herself, smiling politely, and welcomed them in. They began with questions about Bert Montoya. Dorothea kept to her original story, that he was away on vacation in Mexico with family. Cabrera also asked about another tenant, Benjamin Fink, who had reportedly disappeared months before. Dorothea admitted he had lived there, but claimed she'd asked him to leave because of his drinking, and she hadn't seen him since. When Cabrera asked if they could look around, Dorothea agreed without hesitation. Inside the house, the detectives found something odd. Scattered in different rooms were small blue capsules. A closer look revealed they were a mix of diazepam, a medication used to calm anxiety, and flurazepam, commonly used to treat insomnia. Then they noticed another substance, a fine white powder. It was lye, a chemical used for curing certain materials, making soap, and breaking down animal tissue. In the wrong hands, it could also be used on human remains. The officers exchanged glances. This was more than suspicious. It was alarming. Before coming to the house, Cabrera had spoken to Judy again, and she'd repeated her warning. Bring shovels. With that in mind, he asked Dorothea if they could check the backyard. To his surprise, she agreed without protest. The November air was cool as Cabrera and his team stepped into the yard. The garden was well kept, with flowers, neat pathways, and a gazebo. Dorothea stood on the second floor balcony, watching as they began to dig in one of the chosen spots. The first few inches revealed nothing unusual. Then, Cabrera's shovel struck something soft, scraps of pink cloth. He set them aside and kept digging. A few more inches down, he uncovered pieces of something pale and leathery. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking at. Then his shovel hit something hard. He set the tool aside, climbed into the hole, and reached down. When he pulled it free, the reality struck him immediately. He was holding a human femur bone. The pale pieces he'd found earlier weren't leather at all. They were human skin. The garden was no longer just a peaceful space behind a boarding house. It was now an active crime scene. Cabrera believed they had found Bert Montoya, but the coroner's initial inspection brought a surprise. This body was much smaller than Bert, and the remains appeared to be those of a petite, older woman. The level of decomposition suggested she had been buried months before Bert had even gone missing. It was possible the body had been there long before Dorothea moved in, she claimed, but Cabrera wasn't convinced. With no immediate proof tying her directly to the remains, the officers let her return home. And to keep things moving, Dorothea gave permission to continue digging the rest of the yard. The next day, November 12th, The street outside 1426 F Street was lined with curious neighbors and news crews. Yellow police tape marked the perimeter. Inside, Cabrera's team dismantled the gazebo and began turning over the soil beneath it. Dorothea and her tenants stayed indoors, the sound of shovels and machinery carrying through the walls. By mid-morning, Dorothea stepped outside and approached Cabrera. She asked if she could go to a nearby hotel cafe with her nephew to get coffee. The noise was making it hard for her to relax. Cabrera hesitated, then asked her directly, "Are you under arrest?" "No," she replied. By law, without an arrest, they couldn't detain her. Cabrera walked her to the hotel himself, then returned to the yard. Not long after, a shout came from one of the dig sites. Cabrera rushed over to find another body. This one curled into a fetal position, wrapped in cloth, and dusted with the same white powder they'd found inside the house. His commanding officer looked at him sharply. "Where's Dorothea?" Cabrera's stomach dropped. He ran to the hotel, but she was gone. While the detectives had been digging, Dorothea had quietly left with one of her tenants, taken a taxi to a Sacramento bar, and then caught another cab to Stockton. From there, she boarded a bus to Los Angeles. By the time authorities realized she had vanished, she could have been anywhere. Her photograph, a gentle-faced elderly woman in glasses, began appearing on television screens across the country. The hunt for Dorothea Puente had begun. Within hours of finding that second body, the urgency of the investigation grew. Dorothea Puente, once seen as a harmless grandmotherly figure, was now a fugitive. Police feared she might already be on her way to Mexico. The thought was unsettling. If she crossed the border, she could vanish entirely. Meanwhile, the digging at 1426 F Street didn't stop. As the shovels bit into the earth and the scent of disturbed soil filled the air, a third body came to light. This one was large, tall, broad, and heavy set, and showed less decay than the others. Cabrera's instincts told him what the coroner later confirmed. They had found Bert Montoya. For Judy Moyes, the news was a crushing blow. She had fought for years to help Bert find stability, believing she had finally succeeded when she placed him in Dorothea's boarding house. Now, the truth was almost too heavy to bear. The very place she thought would protect him had become the setting of his last days. The search didn't end there. Over the following days, more bodies emerged from the garden soil. 4 more, in various states of decay. Some were wrapped in fabric, some dusted with white powder, all buried quietly beneath the life of the boarding house above. The final count was 7 victims: Bert Montoya, 52, Benjamin Fink, 55, Dorothy Miller, 64, Leona Carpenter, 78, Betty Palmer, 78, James Gallup, 62, Vera Faye Martin, 64. All had lived under Dorothea's roof. All were still having their Social Security checks collected after their deaths. The cause of death was difficult to pin down. The coroner found traces of various medications, anticonvulsants, antidepressants, antipsychotics, painkillers, and tranquilizers in the remains. In every case, there were signs of flurazepam, the same type of pill found inside Dorothea's home. But the exact dosages couldn't be measured after so much time. The medical examiner couldn't say for certain whether the drugs had been given in lethal amounts or if the victims had died from other causes. Still, one room in the house offered a grim suggestion. While inspecting the property again, Cabrera noticed something odd in one of the bedrooms. The carpet felt unusually soft, as though there were layers beneath it. When he began peeling it back, the smell told him what he was about to find. Beneath the padding on the hardwood floor were large, dark stains, the kind left by fluids from a body. It was likely here, Cabrera thought, that some of the victims had died or been prepared for burial. Even as these discoveries came to light, Dorothea Puente was still out there. News reports carried her image nationwide. To most viewers, her face didn't fit the crimes. She looked like someone's grandmother, not a serial killer. But just 5 days after she walked away from 1426 F Street, she surfaced in Los Angeles. On the evening of November 16th, Dorothea walked into a bar and sat down beside a man named Charles Wilgo. Introducing herself as Donna Johansson, she struck up a conversation, asking him about his Social Security benefits and half joking that they should live together. Before leaving, she gave him her motel address and phone number. Hours later, Charles happened to see the news. There, on the screen, was the same woman from the bar, only she wasn't Donna Johansson. She was the woman wanted in connection with multiple murders in Sacramento. Shaken, he called the police. In the early hours of November 17th, officers surrounded the motel. Inside, they found Dorothea dressed neatly in shades of pink and purple, with an umbrella in one hand and a purse holding nearly $3,000. The cuffs clicked shut. The hunt was over. Dorothea Puente was taken from Los Angeles back to Sacramento, her frail figure surrounded by flashing cameras and the steady shouts of reporters. She said little as she was escorted, only offering that she had once been a good person. Whatever she meant by that, it did nothing to soften the shadow of the charges now hanging over her. While she sat in custody, Detective Cabrera's work was far from over. The discovery of 7 victims in her garden raised an obvious question. Could there be more? That question began to find its answer when families who had known Dorothea in earlier years started calling the police. Among them was the family of Ruth Monroe, the woman who had moved into the house in 1982 and died suddenly just weeks later. They had long suspected Dorothea had poisoned her, but in 1982 there had been no proof, only a coroner's ruling of suicide. Now, with the news of the garden graves, they were determined to see her charged. Then Cabrera heard from another family, the relatives of 77-year-old Everson Gilmouth. Everson's connection to Dorothea went back to the early 1980s when she was still in prison. Somehow they had met through letters, and their correspondence turned into a romance. When Dorothea was released in 1985, Everson moved into the F Street house, and they began making plans for a shared future. But by September of that same year, he was gone. The last anyone in his family heard was a phone call in mid-September, after which he seemed to vanish. Dorothea kept up the illusion for years, writing letters to his relatives and pretending to be a new woman Everson had supposedly run off with. The deception had been enough to quiet suspicion, until now. The truth began to surface when Cabrera looked into a case from January 1986, just months after Everson disappeared. That winter, a box had been found by the Sacramento River. Inside was the body of a man so badly decomposed that neither his identity nor his cause of death could be determined. At the time, no one had connected it to Dorothea. But now the timeline fit, and so did another piece of information. In late 1985, Dorothea had hired a handyman to build a wooden box, specifying it should be about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. When he delivered it, she later asked him to help her move it, saying it was full of books and other heavy items. They loaded it into a truck, but instead of heading to a storage facility as she had first claimed, she directed him toward the river. At one point, confused by her shifting directions, he said he didn't know where to go. She told him to just leave it by the water. That box matched the one found in January 1986. Every time investigators thought the list of possible victims had ended, another name seemed to appear. What began as a single missing person case now carried 9 separate first-degree murder charges. But Dorothea refused to admit to a single killing. She insisted she had cared for her tenants, that they had died of natural causes, and that she had only hidden their bodies to avoid trouble for running a boarding house when she wasn't legally allowed to. She admitted to taking their social security checks, more than $100,000 over the years, but nothing more. It would be nearly 4 years before the trial began. In November 1992, jury selection started for what would become one of the most closely watched murder trials in California history. Dorothea, now 63, didn't take the stand in her own defense. Her lawyers argued that there was no way to prove the drugs found in the victims' bodies had caused their deaths. The prosecution countered that Dorothea had deliberately targeted people who were isolated and vulnerable, with no one to protect them and no one likely to notice if they disappeared. As one prosecutor put it, she chose tenants with no family to look after them, no friends to miss them, and no power to save themselves. She profited from their weakness and from their deaths. The jury deliberated for 24 days, the longest in California history at the time. In the end, they could not agree on all 9 charges. Dorothea was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She never admitted guilt. She spent the rest of her life behind bars, speaking rarely to reporters, and choosing to focus on the image she had built of herself as a caregiver, despite the horror uncovered at 1426 F Street. On March 27, 2011, at the age of 82, Dorothea Puente died in prison of natural causes, a quiet end that none of her victims were granted. The house on F Street still stands. Built in the 1890s, it cannot be torn down due to its historical status. Today, it is privately owned, but its history is impossible to erase. Some have turned it into a kind of attraction, with mannequins in the yard and signs that play darkly on its past. But beyond the morbid curiosity, the case is remembered for something more haunting: the way appearances fooled almost everyone. Bert Montoya and the others were people society had overlooked, yet their deaths revealed the truth about the woman so many had trusted. Judy Moyes believes Bert was meant to expose Dorothea Puente, to show how easily the world will side with a polished, smiling face over someone like him. In the end, his disappearance brought the truth to light, ending the life of a serial killer hiding in plain sight. If you'd like more stories told just like this, in a way you can listen to and reflect on, make sure you subscribe to the channel. It's free, and it lets me keep bringing you these cases. And if you found this one compelling, tap the like button. It tells me you want more long-form stories like this. Until next time, stay safe, take care of yourself, and may your night be peaceful.